2013. So it's been, oh, I better watch what I say. So we're really happy to have her back. Sue is an excellent, engaging speaker, and I even though the topic she covers isn't always a happy one, we are really happy to have her here because she makes it very listenable and inspirational. So Sue is a research scientist and affiliate professor at the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels in the biology department of the University of Washington. She has 40 years of research experience focused on the ecology, bioacoustics, and natural history of whales and dolphins, with most of her work directed toward research on bowhead and gray whales in the Pacific Arctic region. Sue worked for NOAA Fisheries for 20 years, serving as the director of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center Marine Mammal Lab as a senior scientist, and for the NOAA Fisheries Science and Technology Marine Division. Sue currently serves as a science advisor to the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission, NOAA Marine Mammal Unusual Mortality Event Working Group, and the Washington State Academy of Sciences. And even with all of that, she's such a down-to-earth person and makes science so understandable. I love listening to her. So in May, for those of you who aren't aware, an unusual mortality event for gray whales was declared on the eastern North Pacific population, which migrate between the Alaskan Arctic and Baja, California, where Cindy just got back from on San Ignacio Lagoon. Sue will present an overview of gray whale ecology with a focus on the recent changes in the North Pacific and Arctic marine ecosystems to provide a context for what's going on during this unusual mortality event and other similar events that the whales have been through. Thank you so much for joining us, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. That was really a very nice introduction. And thank you all for being here today, especially on such a beautiful afternoon. Thanks to those joining on Zoom. As Susan just said, I'm affiliate professor now at Center for Ecosystem Sentinels, but I've been studying gray whales really since I first went up to Alaska in 1981. So to do the arithmetic quickly for you, that's 41 years. I became so interested in how these animals feed up there in comparison to bowhead whales, which I also focus on, and belugas. And that's really what I did my PhD on, was habitat selection among those three different types of whales. They eat very different things and they eat in different ways. But I've kept my interest in gray whales. We could go to the next slide. And I'm going to present today in basically 3 steps. The first is probably going to be review for everyone, but I thought I'd start with gray whale basics. Just a reminder or a refresher in terms of the migration and feeding that they do each year, their migratory cycle. And then also a word about populations and subgroups in the North Pacific, because while we do have a main herd, we have hundreds of whales that are sort of subpopulations, and they do some interesting things too, especially when you start wanting to think about how they're feeding and what that means for body condition. Then I will indeed focus on the UME, or Unusual Mortality Event. We have one that's still ongoing, started in 2019, as Susan just said. But for me and a few others that have hair my color, we saw this 20 years ago. And when this started happening again, we looked around, the 3 of us that were left that studied the first one, and thought, what is going on? This is happening again. So anyway, I will discuss that. Many of the whales that we see are quite thin, some emaciated. And so you'll read in the newspaper, it must be food. The climate is changing so quickly, the oceans are warming, and especially up north, we have huge sea ice loss, many ecosystem changes, must be to food, and that's why they're starving. So with a group of very talented folks, we worked together the last couple of years to produce a paper with the best available information we have on the gray whales themselves, how they have shifted in their habitats up north. The food that they eat, they're the only species that can feed on food that's in the benthos. So we have measurements of those, and then we also have a model for the things that they eat in the water column. So I will really focus on that today, and I'll try to live up to Susan's admonition that I'm making it clear, but you may see this hand waving thing going on. And if I'm confusing you, just please stop me, because I don't want to go on if you don't understand what I'm saying. And then I'll end up with gray whales as sentinels, something that I've been thinking that they are for the last decade. So talking about the changes in prey that I will describe, and then kind of trying to bring it back home here. What is the role for the sounders or some of these smaller groups that we can see and we know by the individual? So that's the talk in 3 steps. So just by way of review, next slide. Again, I'm sure for most people here, you know that the gray whale is the only species in the family Eschrichtidae. So they're a very unusual baleen whale. The adults get between 42, 49 feet, with the females being larger. This is a large female with a calf. The photo taken as it was migrating north in April of 2016 in the central California area. So this photo was taken with a hexacopter. They're feeding generalists. They are the only suction feeding baleen whale, as I said, but they can feed on epibenthos. They can feed on herring roe at the surface. They can feed on zooplankton. So they are feeding generalists. When you're trying to figure out if it's a lack of food, this complicates your problem in terms of evaluation. So they were extirpated in the Atlantic around 1740, although occasionally they will show up there. In the North Pacific, we have 2 recognized populations. The Eastern North Pacific population, which is the main herd, about 21,000 animals. A Western North Pacific population that is still recognized as a separate subgroup, but we know that there's genetic exchange now between that Western population, which is over in the Sea of Okhotsk by Sakhalin. And then we have feeding subgroups. We have a Pacific Coast feeding group that never does make the full migration north and summers between Northern California and Gulf of Alaska. And of course, we have the sounders. The long migration is just the Eastern North Pacific herd, and they round trip is about 10,000 miles. And we do have these surprise sightings. You may have heard about the gray whale seen in Hawaii. In February in the Mediterranean, a gray whale showed up in 2021, Namibia 2013. Those are just examples. So I put that on there because I do think gray whales are a survivor group, and they will range and try out their luck, especially the younger juvenile animals, the younger males especially. But I will get back to that towards the end. Next, please. So this is a little bit washed out, but I just wanted to review again the Eastern North Pacific herd, the 21,000 animals. Breed down here primarily in 3 breeding lagoons, but they will come around into the Gulf of California here. Breeding here, migrating close to shore, all the way up to the northern Bering Sea. I'll be talking about this region today at Chirikov Basin. It's just south of Bering Strait, and into the Chukchi Sea. So this is the feeding area that I will be talking about today. But in fact, even though you'll read that they do not eat except in the north, there are many records, this taken from a chapter in the gray whale book way back in '84, where Mary Narini compiled for us all these records of feeding all the way along the migration. Now, we don't think that they take on their major food source there, but it's also not true that they absolutely don't feed. There are records of feeding, and it's been very well documented. These again are the other groups. So there's about 300 Western North Pacific whales. Again, they summer off Sakhalin in the Sea of Okhotsk. The Pacific feeding group, which is fairly widely spread in summer, perhaps best studied right now by a group, Lee Torres and her group with Oregon State University off Newport, Oregon. But the feeding group has been studied in the past by Dave Duffus and his group along Vancouver. So we have quite a bit of specific information on how gray whales feed, what they're feeding on, and how they prey switch from this Pacific Coast feeding group, because you have the luxury of knowing the animals you're looking at and what they're feeding on. And I would say the same is true of the sounders. You know they're coming in here for about 3 months. They're feeding on ghost shrimp. And then you can take these great photographs and literally measure the difference in their girth and their body condition. This is really important because you can't do that in the Chukchi Sea. We don't know the individuals there. Next, please. So dead whale on the beach. This is what people, and a lot of this is volunteer, have been looking at for the last 3 years. And it's done under NOAA's Marine Mammal Health and Stranding group, which has a subgroup that I'm still a member of on the UME mortality group. So we meet once a year. We used to meet in person once a year. We meet once a month when there's a mortality event. And I just wanted to put this up here because it really is a team of people. Deb Farquhar, who works for NOAA, she is the coordinator of all the UMEs, of which there are multiple ongoing. For the gray whale group, you have these what are called offsite coordinators, Kate Savage for Alaska. You basically have one per state, and another for Mexico and for Canada, because this is an international effort. So it really is a team of people. And then the liaisons, me, Francis Gull, and John Kalmakitis, who I'm sure many of you know, and Jason Baker are on from the UME working group to try to make sure we're coordinating all this. Next, please. And this is just a bar graph, a histogram of the counts starting in 2015. I was not on the working group at that time. I joined in 2016. I do remember being asked what it was kind of getting up here. It was, we usually have 18 to 20 strandings a year along that whole range. And when it starts getting this high, people are starting to, well, should we call a UME? Because that brings in that team of people. And then that one passed, the numbers went down, everybody was breathing easy until 2019, when we had 216 dead whales. So that's 10 times the usual number. It stayed roughly 10 times the usual number in 2020. And the coverage on the beach and everything was a little bit different that year because that was the first COVID year. And so the capability of the teams to go out was compromised somewhat. 2021, it felt like coverage was better. We were down to 114. And as you see, we've got, I think, about 20 or so this year so far. But you see, it does, this one seems to be tailing off. And this is a difference from the 1999-2001, which had 2 very high years, those 2 years, and then went immediately back down to roughly 18 to 20 a year. So those are the numbers for these 3 years. And luckily we seem to be tailing off, but then one still wonders what caused this. Next, please. We started wanting to look at live whales, not just the dead whales on the beach, which is a lot of work by a lot of people. But in Mexico, talking with Jorge Urban and Steve Schwartz, who have worked down in San Ignacio Lagoon for 40 years also, they were able to say, you know, even in 2018, Sue, the juveniles coming into the lagoons and the non-lactating whales, they were thinner, and that just kept going up in 2018, 2019. Big aerial survey program that I initially started out on was still ongoing up and through 2019. And they were saying, you know, in these more recent years, the feeding in the Chukchi Sea, the animals seem to have shifted offshore. And we don't know if that means they're shifting to poorer food or what's going on with that. So we made that, the group of us that wrote this paper, that became the focus of our investigation. And I just like to stop and emphasize here that it's the focus of our investigation sort of after the fact. It's not, I call this paper that we just finished a quilt. It's not a blanket. We went to get the best information we could on the whales and their movements, the best information on the food. We did a modeling exercise to look at food that we could not measure, and we tried to bring that together in the best story we could. So that is the type of investigation. What you'd really rather have is let's actually think about how we do the sampling that we need to do. So I just wanted to make that distinction for you. This is the best assemblage of information that we could do, but it's not science in the way that you form a hypothesis and then you go out and get data and you know that it's thought through in the beginning. So you do a little bit tap dancing with the data you have. Next, please. So before I start launching and talking to you about food, I wanted to show you the 2 primary suspects in this talk. And that is amphipods, particularly tube-dwelling amphipods that build tube mats on the seafloor. And when a gray whale feeds on them, it goes down, turns on one side, uses its tongue like a piston, and it literally picks up these mats of these stuck together tubes that that animal is living in. And then when it comes to the surface, it pushes most of the sediment out in these, you can just see it like pumping the dirt out through that coarse baleen. And the amphipods are stuck on the inside and they get sucked down. And that's how they feed, and they do that for hours and hours. And they'll find a bed and they'll turn and they'll do it again and again. And that is what we used to see in the Chiricahua Basin in the Northern Bering Sea in the 1980s all the time. Whales everywhere, mud plumes everywhere. This is a gray whale skim feeding a little bit further north in Alaska in an area where actually bowhead whales feed a lot on krill. And so this baleen is nothing like bowhead baleen, which is long and finely fringed and great for catching krill, but it doesn't stop our gray whales. They go out there and they put those rostrums up and they just mow back and forth as if they had stylish baleen just the same way that the bowheads do. And they do that for hours. So we know that they can feed on krill. And I wanted to point this out specifically because these are the two types of animals I'll be talking about today. But as you know, they can also feed on epifauna, that's animals that live just above the bottom. And they, same thing, suction, they'll go down and suction mysids, cumasians, crab larvae. They're really good hoovers, no matter whether it's in the mud, just above the mud, or at the surface. So going back in time, and this is about the only thing that I'll speak specifically on to what we were able to do in terms of looking at the 99-2000 event. As I told you, there were high mortalities and then they dropped. And we had some extra time, sampling time from an aircraft in 2001. So I went with a person that had done the surveys exactly as we had done them in the 80s. And this was the distribution of gray whales in the 80s. So you're at the Bering Strait here, and that little oval that you saw on the big drawing, this is Chiricahua Basin. And as you can see, it was just kind of chock-a-block with gray whales at that time in the 80s, 1981 to 85. When we went back in 2001, gray whales stopped about here. And then this, you would see a few whales here and there. And it was this area that the whales were moving into, the southern Chukchi Sea. There had been a 17-fold decline in gray whales feeding there. So we did think if you were a gray whale, that was your, if you have site fidelity to feeding there, then yes, you would be finding less food. And so we wanted to take that forward into, our investigation for this current event. And the best data set we had was from the big aerial survey program that, I don't know if you can see these little dashed lines, but this survey program did this whole area and they did it routinely so that you know that where you don't see the colored dots, it doesn't mean that they didn't look for them there, they did. And so this is the distribution of gray whales that we have from the aerial surveys of Arctic marine mammals, ASAM. So you'll see that on a lot of the maps. And it gave us our broadest look at where are the gray whales now. And the two colors that you see reflect what the surveyors were telling us, and that is that around 2015, instead of being distributed where you see the yellow dots, so that, I know you can't read this, but from 2009 to 2014, the gray whales are shown as yellow dots. From 2015 to 2019, they're shown as pink dots. And what the surveyors were telling us is, Sue, they're not here anymore, they're out here. And out here is more at the head of, you see this darker blue, there's a canyon, there's a submarine canyon there, and the whales were feeding right over that submarine canyon. So they had shifted out there. What were they feeding on out there? We weren't sure. Didn't see the big mud plumes. They're feeding on something that's epibenthic or not. You'll also see what I call a little ditch here. And we've had gray whales feed there all the time, always have in the southern Chukchi Sea, but we also saw this extension southward. And we think that is because that's where the krill come into the system. So What we wanted to know then is, was this a significant shift? And how much more, if more, were gray whales feeding there? And if so, on what? That's what we're trying to find out. Next. We had one more source of data, and that is visual surveys from people standing a marine mammal watch on research vessels as they transit up through Bering Strait and do biological and physical sampling at what we call high productivity regions. So again, this is the northern end of Chirikov Basin that I showed you before, just south of the strait. And this is distributed biological observatory box 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's in those boxes that we have the specific data on the infauna, on the amphipods. So this is data brought in by a researcher named Jackie Grebmeyer. She has been studying the amphipods for as long as I've been studying the whales. And she is the first person that really woke me up to this area losing amphipods, because I was giving a talk on gray whales and she came up afterwards and she said, well, their food's not there anymore, their amphipods are going away. So we've been working together pretty much ever since. This is the aerial survey data again that I just showed you. It's got little boxes around it now too, because again, we need to enumerate what's going on physically in these areas where the gray whales are clustered in their distribution. So these were the sources of the data for the paper. And the reason you see these box regions is that's where we could do our statistical analyses that we had to do to do the comparison. So next slide, please. And this in just one slide is the results from the benthic prey. So again, this is Jackie's data. And she has measured amphipods and DBO2. You see the box has shrunk up quite a bit. DBO3, this is a very hot spot area for gray whales now, 4 and 5. So just those 5. I won't bother you with the rest. The green lines and everything are just a demonstration of how much the sea ice has changed and pulled back in the region. And I'm happy to talk more about this later if you want. But the point here is we have specific information on what gray whales eat in those areas. And to my surprise, in regions 4 and 5, there was no decline in food. So, you know, that's not what I expected at all. I thought we'd have some decline in all these areas, but up here, no. DBO3, in the benthos, the dominant prey has switched from an animal called Bibulus to an animal called Pontoporia, which is just a long name. Pontoporia is also a bigger animal. So all of those animals still live in the infauna, but it seems to me that food has gotten better in the southern Chukchi Sea. And then in region 2, we have that continued decline, like we saw back in the early 2000s. So food is still declining here, but it's not a new decline. So I don't see how that could have set off necessarily this latest event. It doesn't make it a good place to go feed, but only one region does the decline continue. This region, you have a different species of animal. And then in this region, it's like, well, what the heck's going on there? And I would remind you that it's this region in the northern Chukchi that I was pointing out that difference between yellow and pink dots. So that's where they're moving offshore. So that is when we decided, okay, how do we look at this region? Again, now you're up in the very northern part of Alaska. This is Utqiagvik, used to be known as Barrow here. So you're in the very northeast Chukchi Sea. And the different colors are different months. July is green, August red, and September blue. And we wanted to know what was going on in this area where the animals used to feed versus this more offshore area. And the way that we did that is to make histograms of sighting rates. And that's basically a relative abundance. In other words, how many whales do you see per kilometer of flight? And when we did that for all these years, it turns out that this pink box area, if you just look at the pink bars in 2015, suddenly there's just a lot more gray whales being seen out here than the yellow bars, which again were the earlier dates to 2014. These dates, 2015 to 2019. This again is July, August, September. So we know, in fact, that that shift was happening after 2015. We think that it has something to do with krill, because immediately adjacent over here in this area, this is where bowheads are feeding on krill like crazy. And so the person doing this work, Steve Okenen, said, hey, Sue, let me extend my model in terms of wind shift and how that affects krill. So krill come up through Bering Strait and into this area. And as long as winds are prevailing this way, they just kind of keep getting blown offshore. But if you have an easterly wind, that will cause them to be upwelled. And what Steve was looking for is whether it would also cause them basically to be shunted down that canyon. And that's basically what he could show in his model. So next slide. Oh, well, that's it for that slide. He did the same model. Now I'm in the southern Chukchi Sea. Sorry, but these were the slides that I have from the paper, and I know it's back and forth. He did that same weather pattern look, and it turns out winds didn't have any effect here. And in fact, what did was simply the bathymetry, this ditch that both the amphipods are living in this region, but also the krill are streaming in. And you can see the krill better here because they have acoustic instruments that can see the layers of krill coming in. So the bottom line is, Northeast Chukchi Sea, no difference in the infauna that the gray whales eat, but we think they're having more opportunity to eat krill up in the Northeast Chukchi Sea. Here, this is a breadbasket form, kind of in the way that the Chirikov Basin used to be in the Northern Bering Sea. Northern Bering Sea, that big feeding area from the 80s and 90s has really shrunk up, and it's not coming back because of the physics. So the animals that the gray whales used to feed on there, they need fine sand to build those tube mats that they live in. And the whole push into that area and through Bering Strait has increased by 50%. And this has to do with wind patterns and the warming of the planet. So when you have the water moving faster, that silt that the amphipods need, it doesn't make its way to the bottom. Instead, it's coarse sand. And so the sediment where the amphipods used to live is coarse sand. They can't make their tubes out of coarse sand. The only place they can make their tubes now is as the ocean water gets pushed towards Bering Strait, it slows it down. The land literally slows the water down. And therefore, the smaller particles can get to the bottom and the amphipods still live there. So that's what's going on with that. Again, take home message, 3 out of 4 areas. I cannot demonstrate a real decline in food. So why do we have skinny whales? And why do we have this episodic unusual mortality event? The two things that spring to my mind are, again, as I said a little bit earlier, if you are site specific to where you go feed, because you go where your mom took you back, and it happens to be the Chirikov Basin, that's not great unless you start exploring out other places. But if you're going further north, at least by what we can measure, and again, all of these study areas, even though we think they're enormous when we're working them, you know, you're looking down a straw as far as the ocean's concerned. Gray whales feed through a huge range, and these are just example areas that I've talked about today. But we have other things going on in the system with a warming ocean, and I think that what might be happening is the gray whales become food stressed, and that opens the door to some sort of virus or some sort of wasting disease, such as we've seen in hoofed animals. I cannot prove that, and I've talked with Francis Gulland and others who are specialists in this. The problem there is getting the kind of samples you need to run to search for viruses. Usually by the time the animals are on the beach, their decomposition is such that you can't sample for the types of materials, the type of lung material you need, the type of tissue you need to search for viruses. We did get interest from the NIH this year, actually, the mortality group. And so we have done some viral runs at their expense, which is great because the team cannot afford that. But as yet, and I think it has more to do with sampling, teasing out that potential for disease there's some event aspect to this that we're just not catching if you're just looking at food. Next. So gray whales as ecosystem sentinels. Well, maybe I'm just repeating myself over and over. I've been saying this now for decades, but I've also expanded it to other species. I mean, there's a lot of different animals that could be ecosystem sentinels, but basically what I focus on is something called upper trophic level species. And by that, I just mean fish, birds, and mammals, marine fish, birds, and mammals. And so this is from another paper, but the whole concept here is a simple one. Climate change is the big driver. That's the big cog, that's the big wheel. And that is shifting things in habitats due to what's biophysical forcing. So it's the physics, it's the heat and the wind, and that's changing the prey or the food. So the big cog is changing the habitat for the animal. You get extrinsic or external responses, and the animal responds by shifting its range, its timing, or just hotspots where it's eating. And you study that if you're an ecologist such as myself. But that cog causes internal changes in the animal itself, which is a physiological change in diet, body condition, and chemistry. And if you study these two cogs, this whole thing works together. And that is why the animal reflecting back to you, it's shifting over and eating on krill, or telling you about what's going on in the ecosystem. They're telling us what's going on in the ecosystem, and we just need to understand their ecology and their physiology well enough to interpret what they're telling us. Next. Didn't talk at all today about anthropogenic footprint, but it's the gorilla in the box. Some of those gray whales have been struck by ships. Some of those gray whales have been pulling net, they've been entangled, and even if they've gotten rid of it, they've been stressed by that. It's hard to enumerate that sometimes. Sometimes you can tell when you find a dead animal on the beach, but sometimes even if it's been struck by a ship, until you actually have time to do a necropsy, you don't realize that in the neck region vertebrae, that's usually what kills them. So it's the anthropogenic footprint that we can't forget either. And that's the one to me that we can do the most about in terms of our actions, or most immediately about anyway. So that's just a conceptual. Gray whales as ecosystem sentinels. Next. Wanted to come back to the sounders because John Kalmakita is working with John Durbin and Holly Fernbeck, and I imagine folks in this room know these people, but I was really amazed. Early in the 2019, they approached the UME team and said, why don't we do some hexacopter work? We can track individuals. And we were all surprised at how fast these whales could fatten up on ghost shrimp. So you come in like this in February, and by April, you're looking like this, but not everybody. So next slide. So that whale knows how to feed on these ghost shrimp and come in, in this tidal area. And you folks know these whales better than I. I'm not sure the individual, but this whale comes in. He's not doing so well feeding on ghost shrimp. He's not figuring it out, and he's just getting thinner from February through April. So when I saw this, I thought, wow, you know what the animal's feeding on. The behavior matters. So we all think of these whales as going out and they know exactly what they're doing. Well, if you don't, you're not going to get fatter. And we're going to interpret health by body condition and girth for the most part. And so we might assume this whale is sick or, dying or whatever. And if it leaves then this area and goes out and can feed more efficiently on a different type of prey, it just makes the where you're feeding and on what you're feeding, to me, more important. So that was just my example of sounders, and then I think it's great that people are so excited about these animals and that they're coming in, and that you're paying attention and having festivals like Welcome the Whales and connecting people to what's really happening out there. The other thing that John has pointed out for years, but I find interesting because it happens in San Francisco Bay too, and a little bit in San Diego Bay, is that right before or on the UME years, it seems as though more sounders have been added. So in the 1990s, as you all know, you had about 6 whales coming in. 1999, boom, you kind of then get 10 whales, and you have 10 whales for quite a long time. And you get down here to 2018, 2019, bang, you get 16 or 17 whales. And so again, it's kind of this, if they're sentinels, they should be able to flag something for you. And to me, when you folks see more whales coming in up here, we should say, wait a minute, something going on. Same thing in San Francisco in that area, which they are doing. We talk about this a lot on our monthly phone calls. And so we're trying to think about how do we, let's hope this doesn't happen 20 years from now. And if it is, you won't see me probably up here talking to you about it. But when it happened again, after 20 years, again, we were just kind of dumbfounded and started looking for clues that maybe we should have seen a little bit more clearly. But after this one, we want to make sure we write those clues down, make it clear that these animals are telling us something. They are sentinels about something's going wrong here, even if we don't know exactly what it is. Next. And these new arrivals, you know, they can be surprising. So I got an email from Jen Rusek, Dr. Rusek, and she says, I think gray whales ate our experiment. So she studies eelgrass, and she's been studying eelgrass for a long time. And she's out there with a student in Willapa Bay, and they had staked out this area. They had 80 stakes, and they wanted to know how ghost shrimp were affecting, you know, the eelgrass. She said, our area looked like it had been bombed. And here's poor Wes standing in a feeding pit. And she said, what would do this? And I said, well, gray whales. And I said, well, do you see them out there? She goes, we don't look for whales. And she said, no, they hadn't. But anyway, they are measuring density. Good for Jen. In the gray whale area, they're going to go back. So she described the pits, 300 to 400 per meter squared. And they're gonna follow up on this, although that is not their preferred study system. She said there were 7 stakes that survived. You know, and I talked to John about it too, John Candlecuse. He said, yeah, he hadn't seen too many gray whales in there. He's a little worried because they do use pesticides. And he said, you don't want gray whales in there feeding, but obviously some had been in there. So I'm going to stay in touch with Jen on this and, you know, try to follow up on that. So she didn't like the new arrivals and hopes that that does not become a whale watching area. And I think that's about where we're at. Yes. So again, just for me, it's marine birds, mammals, fish. They are all can be sentinels. Ribbon seals, we've got acoustic recorders up north, and we're showing that ribbon seals are going much further north than they ever used to in the Arctic because they can, and because there's things for them to eat up. My beloved bowhead whales, can't do a talk without them. They are really showing us that with the warmer climate, they do have more krill to eat. Their fall migration is much later than it used to be. The spring migration has changed slightly, but mostly the fall migration, they're later coming back. The Center for Ecosystem Sentinels, really the foundation is long-term penguin studies by Dean Boersma, who's here with me today. Galapagos penguins, 50 years, Magellanic penguins, 40 years. The center really wants to be a place where people can still come and study whole organism ecology. That seems to be on the wane as we have genomics and a lot of other disciplines, all of them great. But in terms of whole organism ecology, we're trying to create a center that maximizes use of long-term data sets, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and also hands those data sets over to a next generation for new questions coming in, instead of having it just go out with that one person's career. So that's what we're trying to grow at the university at this point. You can see all kinds of great videos and things like that if you want to go to Ecosystem Sentinels. And if you're lying in wait with a penguin question, like I said, Dee's sitting right there. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks for your attention and for coming on such.
Question about Willapa Bay, if they're using pesticides and if the whales keep coming back there, if they're gonna, hopefully there'll be some discussion about, I know there's been conflicts about those pesticides and stuff. But if the whales continue to come in there, that hopefully would add more impetus to maybe not use it.
So before you answer that, if you don't mind, I'm just going to repeat the question so people on Zoom can hear it.
Yeah.
So the question was about the gray whales in Willapa Bay and the use of pesticides, and possibly if there are more gray whales in that area, could that be impetus to stop using pesticides? Was that your question? Okay.
Yes, well, that's exactly what we would hope. And I know with Jen, that's a long-term study site for her. So we will know from her if nobody else. And I did talk to John Calamakitis just a couple of days ago, who also plans to, keep people aware of that. But again, Jen said she'd never seen gray whales in there before. And John said he said what he was mostly worried about is in the, I don't know Willapa Bay, but there's some deep channel. He said humpbacks are coming in there. So, yeah.
What are the pesticides that are being used?
I do not know. I don't know what they use on grass. Sorry.
It's something to do with the oysters or something?
Yeah, they were
Yes.
using imidacloprid on, it's called imidacloprid. They were using it on the oyster farms, and it has been banned. And they've been trying to reinstate it unsuccessfully so far, but I think they are using some other things as well, but that's like the big one that has been a big fight over.
Yeah.
Yeah,
John seemed to indicate there's been a lot of discussion on it.
Yeah. yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Susan.
Do you have any, we've been trying to work with DNR and WDFW on the ghost shrimp harvesting here. And we did get a moratorium for 2 years, and then they reinstated it, and they said they'll only harvest when the whales aren't here. But they used the old calendar of when they used to come and leave, and now that has really changed.
It came early this year, didn't they?
Yeah, and they still won't change it. And their feeling is it's just, there's plenty of ghost shrimp, and maybe there are, but do you have any thoughts on best ways to survey, or do we know how much ghost shrimp is enough? I mean, we have twice as many regular sounders now, plus the stragglers that come in, in a 4-year UME, where some years we've had the whales here all year long.
Mm-hmm.
So any tips you have for us? We're getting ready to meet with them again. But any thoughts that might make them?
Well, just
And I'll just repeat the question really quickly, if you
sorry.
don't mind. Yeah, just for those on Zoom, if you didn't hear that question, it had to do with ghost shrimp harvest in the area where the Sounders gray whales are feeding. And now we have twice as many Sounders as we used to, and they're staying longer. And, what's the best way to kind of regulate that? And we wanted to get Sue's thoughts on that.
From the gray whale perspective, I think we're in a situation that we are still in a UME, and we have animals that are clearly showing us that they're coming in and they're feeding here and they're staying here. And so I do think what should be some sort of special management area. And that's, I guess, what I would argue is, again, the whales are telling us something, and that is that they're coming in and feeding on these ghost shrimp. How many is enough? I hate to start trying to enumerate a benthic predator in that way. In other words, let the animals tell you. And if they're here longer and they're coming earlier, then I really think that it needs to be at least a management area that is uppermost in their mind in terms of when they are allowing humans to come and harvest. Anything else?
Is there you were talking about 3 different trophic levels that the whales feed on up in the Chukchi Sea, I think. And if they're not feeding so much on the benthic organisms, but more on the krill, is there a big difference in the nutritional value between them?
That's the million-dollar question. And the group that Lee Torres is leading down in Oregon State, I think, has the best tact on that right now, because she too has these Pacific Coast feeding group that stay there, and they prey switch from mysids to various other species, and her graduate students are looking at that. To my surprise, the first paper that came out on that about a year ago, the mysids, which are they don't look all that nutritious to me. I would have always thought the amphipod that I showed you, that is lipid rich. It's like eating butterballs. I always thought that would be the most caloric, but actually the mysids, especially in a particular season, it gets a little difficult there too, because these prey go through seasons where they build up their fat and then they don't. But we need more information. I put that on that one slide. We need to do more nutritional studies between krill. Krill are nutritious too. But they're not as lipid rich as those infaunal amphipods. Those are really, really good. But a copepod, for example, the lipid content in a copepod changes a whole lot over the course of a season. Late in summer, they got a lot of oil in them. Early in summer, you know, it's like eating a cracker. So yeah, it's a good question, and we need to do more work there. We can do more work there. And again, Lee and her students are doing that work. That work is not going on up in Alaska. Gray whales are off the endangered species list, and they are not a whale of particular interest to the indigenous people up there. So getting funding to actually do prey studies and things like that up there is hard to do.
Would you say just a little bit more about the ghost shrimp? I mean, here you've got a lot of ghost shrimp. You don't have ghost shrimp up in Alaska that the gray whales.
There's a type of shrimp that's similar. If you in the Bristol Bay area where you'll see gray whales feeding, and all along Vancouver Island, stuff like that. It's not just here. So.
And so that you at Willapa Bay, they're trying to kill the ghost shrimp because they compete with the oysters. Is there anything like that going on in Alaska where people are killing any of these organisms that the whales eat?
No. Yeah, Howard.
A couple of questions, actually. We have gotten some sort of smattering of historical reports of gray whales in the South, way down there in the inlets, and that there used to be ghost shrimp down there. Are you aware of any of that?
Only as told to me by John, again, John Kalmaki is, I don't know specifically, I've not been there myself, but just from what John has told me. What I wanted to bring forward again, though, was the summary that Mary Marini gave us, you know, practically 40 years ago now, in terms of all the different prey that gray whales have been recorded feeding on all along their migration route. Some people think of those now as Tesla stations. You know, they might be stopping along, you know, but and feeding on things. I did a paper with Kate Wynn some years ago because she saw gray whales hanging out by Ugak Bay in Kodiak Island year round, whereas supposedly they were supposed to just be playing through. And Jackie again had a student that went up, and we found out they were feeding on crustaceans. Again, something that doesn't look like it'd be particularly nutritious, but if they're dense enough, the gray whales will suck them up. You know, I sometimes say that eat a box of rocks as long as there's just, you know, as long as there are enough of them.
Also, I've seen old photos from the Bering Sea of trenches, more or less, rather than pits. Is that typical?
They will feed along, you'll see them go down, and of course we can't see through the water, but what seems to be, because you'll see you can almost see them pushing out some of that sand even while they're underwater, is they'll feed along and then they'll come up and then they'll come back right or down. And I think they just pick that trail up, and the mass used to be so extensive in the Chiricahua. And so I don't think that's on one go, but I think they're just, you know, feeding through and coming back around again.
Thank you.
I actually have another question, if you don't mind. Just trying to kind of clarify what you were saying about the prey up in the Chukchi Sea. And is that the area where they're starting to maybe move offshore and feed on krill? But is that also one of the areas where the benthic prey had not declined?
It has not declined.
So, so they're
That's
just,
the thing.
okay.
That's that 4 and 5 areas. Benthic prey has not declined.
But yet,
I think that, and I'm saying this because what we're seeing with the bowheads too, there's just more krill.
okay.
And there's more krill in the system because we have more water, literally 50% more water pushing through Bering Strait, and that's what brings the krill into the system.
So is it possible that there are more gray whales feeding in that area, that some of them are moving in feeding on krill that maybe we're used to feeding in the Bering?
On both.
Okay.
I think they're feeding on both. But these big boluses of krill, and they do come in pulses because it is wind driven. But again, this is a model. I wish that we could get out there and at least scoop up some poop or whatever, because we don't have that confirmation that we do with the bowheads. We know absolutely that they're feeding on krill. And it's pretty darn likely the gray whales are too, but we don't have that confirmation with gray whales.
Okay,
I think they're feeding on both up there. I think they're having a fine time.
great.
Yeah, party down northeast Chukchi Sea.
So my other question is about the Bering Sea where the prey has declined.
Yeah.
The individuals aren't known in that area, so there's no way to really know whether that's maybe a group that's being hit hardest by the
that's just
UME,
totally
right?
The idea that a lot of baleen whales we think are matrilineal in terms of where they, kind of like elephants in the water whole thing. But no, we don't know. We don't know the individuals there. And it's not an easy place to work. I first started talking with Lee Torres because she wanted to go and study there and do what she does off of Newport. And it's not, you can't do it in the Northern Bering Sea. You have to get out there and maybe on a good day, but you'd have to have enough money really to have a research ship behind you, that you'd have to bring your motel and everything with you. And the cost of that is very high. You can't do it from the coast. Anything else? Beautiful afternoon. I think we should all go enjoy it.
Thank you so much. All right, for those of you on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us.